Hello, today I am joined by Catherine Grassu, and we will both be interviewing Sally Steadman from SafeLives. She is the Senior Innovation Lead. How are you today, Sally?
I'm doing really well, thank you.
Good, good. So, SafeLives is a UK-wide charity dedicated to ending domestic abuse. I was just sort of wondering, first off, if Sally, you could kind of give us a bit of an idea of how you got involved with SafeLives, and what the work SafeLives does is specifically.
Yeah, no problem. So I've worked at Safe Lives for 13 years. And as an organisation, we haven't been going for very much longer than that. So I've been here from like the early days. Before that, I worked in a frontline domestic abuse charity, and we were which was in London, and
Mm,
we were working predominantly with high risk victims of domestic abuse. Um, and Many of them, when we would review and reflect on our caseloads, many of them would often be young people under the age of 25, without kind of necessarily meaning to. Our service just generally was um, quite accessible to that age group.
mm,
I've always had an interest in working with young people, like, because when you work in a service like that, it's you're working right on the kind of the front line. So you're working with them in real crisis, real difficulty, often with um, young children as well, or care leavers, and lots of kind of combining issues that just make the way that they seek help and get help a bit more complicated. So um, when I had the chance to work at Safe Lives, I jumped at it because for me, Safe Lives was a chance to really try and um, create systems and more systemic responses to domestic abuse. So what I was doing in a small area in London, I felt like I could kind of elevate that and just have an influence across the country, which
sure.
often we do. A lot of our projects can be national projects or big regions of the country, and really just about transforming the response to domestic abuse, whether
Mm,
that's police forces, children's social care, our training programs, which are independent domestic violence advisor training programs, or we do a whole suite of training. So yeah, the opportunity was perfect for me to just try and influence on that kind of bigger scale.
mm. Okay, did you have a question?
So, yeah, I was just wondering, obviously, you say in particular, um, your charity manages to reach young people. Um, and I was just wondering, obviously, I was on the website earlier, and I managed to get a link through to the Mix Up Is It quiz. And I thought that was really good of a way of, because often people don't know what is normal, or people don't have friends in place to ask, um, is this right, or should I be worried about this? And I was just wondering if you think there could be a way to reach people with that information about people who might be worried that something is abusive but not sure.
Yeah.
Because obviously I found that quiz, but I wouldn't have found that, and obviously in my own experience, I could have used something like that.
Yeah.
And I think, is there a way of getting that sort of really helpful material across to young people in a different way?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely what we in the last few years have really been trying to understand better ourselves, so that our response is um reaching people at the earliest stage, when they
Mm.
start to kind of spot the signs, and helping them do that. So we had a project that we called Draw the Line,
Right.
which was predominantly like an Instagram campaign, but we had some offline content for that as well, like which could be used in schools or in kind of one-to-one
Yeah.
conversations with young people. But it really was about helping young people to identify what behaviour kind of crossed over into abusive behaviour.
Yeah.
and we had a really positive response from that. What we learned from that was, I mean, there were tons of amazing kind of insights. All of it was co-created with young people, so down to like the graphics, the way that the text looked, as well as kind of what the content was like and how we delivered it and where we delivered it. But one of the things we started to identify was just how important the peers are of young people.
Yeah.
To help, for their help seeking. So we talked to them about what made the difference, who they would go to for help, and often they would talk about their friend, a best friend, someone that they could trust. And so we started to then build information around that, which has then led into our Your Best Friend project. So with this project, we're working with 10 partners who work with young people in a variety of different ways. So they might work, be delivering kind of specialist interventions, based on community identity, race, religion, sexuality, gender, just a particular kind of specialism that they support a young person around. And then also we've got some exciting like digital partners that, because obviously, I mean, not all young people live their lives online, but a lot do. We all do right now, don't we, with the pandemic? But making sure that we had a strong digital presence with whatever it is that we wanted to deliver. And it's really about equipping peers to help other young people and support them appropriately, not to overburden them with tons of responsibility, because they're not the police, they're not teachers, they're not social workers. But we know that young people do, they feel the burden of watching a friend struggle with a relationship, not knowing if it's healthy, unhealthy. I mean, young people talk about toxic relationships sometimes, and just really wanting support and the right information, which is often hard to get. So you've got tons of information online, and who knows whether half of it is correct, accurate. Where we are often, as in all kind of walks of life, you kind of you're pushing against the tide of like the myths and stereotypes that sit around domestic abuse, particularly if people don't understand the dynamics, which are complicated, and even professionals, when we train them, still struggle with the issues. So with this project, we hopefully have the chance to give young people the right information and the right tools to support each other, and also then create some boundaries around that, so that that young person who's helping is also feeling kind of safe and is looking after themselves too.
Yeah, I really think that's something a lot of people can relate to, about seeing someone go through this and meaning really well, but not really knowing how to help. And then when somebody does have courage to ask a question or to test the waters with somebody they trust, a lot of the time, without meaning to, people can be like, oh, well, maybe they didn't mean it like that. Or people tend to err on the side of saving the relationship or telling people to sort of stay with the partner. And because they want so badly for it not to be a bad situation, that they tend to ignore signs and things like that. So I think that's really an ideal way to, especially for young people, to sort of break that down and really get an understanding for how best to help each individual person.
Yeah.
Do you think that sort of emotional and psychological abuse gets overlooked by victims? I only say that because a lot of the stories that I read about people who got out of relationships tend to end in people's last straw is physical abuse. So yeah, I was just wondering if you think it is overlooked at all.
I think it is. I think that there's been great strides made to recognise coercive control as an offence. I think we're still a way off in fully implementing that consistently and giving victims, survivors, real clarity about how they evidence this to a level that the police will consistently charge and CPS will consistently prosecute, and that the courts will do the right thing with the right, when they've got the evidence in front of them. So I think there's way to go. We know that survivors will tell us that often the psychological and emotional abuse has far lasting damage than the broken bones, the bruises. They talk about physical healing, but it's the mental trauma that sits with you for often a lifetime. And particularly when you're looking at the home environments that children and young people grow up in, kind of living with high levels of fear and psychological abuse, whether they're witnessing from one parent to another, whether it's directed towards them. It's definitely something that is overlooked. Yeah.
I think going to just to ask about the police sort of response in a way, because again, like often very well-meaning but perhaps maybe not specially trained or slightly undertrained police officers responding to sort of house calls for domestic abuse, do you find that they can put victims off leaving sooner by accident, or that they don't always know the best way to encourage somebody to progress a case? Because obviously there's a lot of trouble with victims going back on cases or going back to abusive situations. And I just wondered if you think there's a way to, from the police side of things, to really get the training at a level where they can deal with that really successfully.
Yeah, absolutely. We, for some time now, we've been delivering whole police force training called Domestic Abuse Matters. And it's a behaviour change programme that really does recognise that you can't just train an individual officer on how to do a good job, that you've got to look at the environment that they work in, that you've got to look at the the structure, the line management structure, so the training goes right through the police force. It's not just the frontline officers that respond, it's the the operator who picks up the 999 phone call. It goes right the way through. So it's about making sure you've got that systemic response within that police force. They've got a really tough job. The resources that they have are not what they need to be, to really fully address domestic abuse. But it's not just a criminal justice problem, but often you get, survivors will reach a point of crisis and just want help. They don't necessarily want a court case, but they want someone to help them. And we've all been brought up that that's the job of the police. And so often they ring 999 not fully kind of intending to be facing a full-on investigation, prosecution and all of that. They just want the abuse to stop and they want to be safe. Yeah. So we absolutely support the police to always try and do a better job. We know despite all the best efforts, things still do go wrong. We are a critical friend in that, but we know that it's not just a police problem to fix. It's not, you're not just going to kind of arrest your way out of this situation, because it's complicated. That we know with the pandemic, the delays in the criminal justice system have just skyrocketed. You've got a backlog of court cases now where survivors are waiting. We hear cases where they're waiting up to 2 years to go into the courtroom and give evidence on a incident that will have happened a long time ago. So victims do fall out of the system because and because they lose trust in it. They don't see the benefit of doing it when it takes so long often for it to get into the court process.
Tragically, domestic abuse has been on the rise, I think, over the last year because of the various lockdowns and coronavirus. Have you seen an increase from your side of things in demand for help and advice to get out of abusive relationships? And how has the coronavirus, the pandemic, affected your work at SafeLives?
So SafeLives as an organisation, I'll probably start there. I think we've always worked kind of across the country, quite remote, and we're quite dispersed as an organisation with a couple of bases in London and Bristol. So when the pandemic hit, we were already kind of ready for remote working, for many of us anyway. So I think that gave us a bit of insight and advantage into just how to mobilise our organisation, and because our primary aim is as a second tier charity to then support the sector. So we don't operate a helpline. We have some direct services, but majority of our work is second tier, supporting the sector and statutory sectors to improve their response. So our position is, we quickly mobilised internally a team to make sure that we were able to offer that support. And quite quickly we saw overnight services having to shut their doors, figure out how to shut their doors from working face to face, really valuing face to face work with their families that they're trying to support, and having to stop that overnight. So that meant vulnerable families were disappearing from sight, and you had school closures, and so vulnerable children were disappearing from sight. So there was an incredible amount of fear and anxiety across the sector as to how they were going to get access to support these families. Initially, they didn't. The domestic abuse sector we had to use our influence along with other key national organisations in the sector to get them recognised as key workers, because once they were, then it would mean that they might be able to then get access to families and be able to deliver services, even though they might be remotely, but still kind of get to mobilise their response. But once that settled a bit, we then started to see the increase in calls for help. I mean, like I said, we don't operate a helpline, but we can follow up through Louisa. We can follow up with plenty of kind of stats and information from a survey that we did with frontline workers, telling us just where with that initial drop in demand, it then quickly rose. And throughout the different lockdowns that we've had, it has had an impact on help seeking. One of the things that we tried to do was to find ways that other professionals who might not have ever had a role in this before could reach in to survivors. So we have a group of pioneers who are people with lived experience of domestic abuse who felt really strongly that we had to give a clear message that professionals, particularly you've got people doing like doorstep food drops, or pharmacies delivering drugs, or whatever the different roles are, like there's opportunities to reach in to people that you might be concerned about. And kind of going back to your point, Catherine, it's like we all know someone we're probably a bit concerned about. we're not necessarily able to fully articulate that, but in lockdown they just become invisible to us. How you check in on them just generally and see how they're doing just becomes a lot harder. So the other impact that obviously the pandemic has had on the sector has been the impact on the mental health and well-being of the staff working in the sector. So we support a group of frontline organisations on a weekly call that we have with them, just to check in with them, see what we can do. And they were telling us loud and clear that their staff they were struggling. We know that the sector will obviously they have to deal with the post-traumatic stress that staff experience, and burnout that staff will experience, but that just seemed to increase because clients, victim survivors, they were presenting not just with domestic abuse, which they were hearing was increasing in frequency, increasing in severity, so just getting worse and happening more often. And that was for existing victims, but for new victims coming forward for the first time as well. But that they were also talking to them about loved ones that might have COVID, who might have passed, or the mental health impact that the pandemic was having on clients. So they were having to deal with such more complicated and complex families because of what impact the pandemic was having on them. So I think it's not necessarily a hidden issue. It's something that we are constantly trying to raise a profile of, but it's we need to think about how we look after the key workers so that they can look after the families that they're wanting to serve and to support. So that's part of our job, is to make sure that they're getting access to the right clinical supervision and support and that kind of thing.
So sort of going to the root of the issue, because I think a lot of people, like we as a society, perhaps often assume that some level of domestic abuse is inevitable, or that because it's always been there, that it's not a problem that we should be aiming to eradicate. And I think obviously one of the biggest differences we can always make is to scale up victim support and improve the quality of refuge and things like that. But going to like alternative strategies to do with perpetration and why people begin to abuse or find themselves in a position where that's what they feel they need to do. How do we move to sort of programs, like psychological programs, where people can be honest and say, look, this is something that I've found myself doing. How can we value people's will to get out of that, and how can we make that happen more regularly, so that perhaps victims can or their children can sort of stay in the home, and perhaps a perpetrator could move to a facility to get help there. Would that be a model that you would recommend, or how would you see that working?
It's a really complicated and complex answer. However, one of the narratives that we are really trying to change and address as an organisation is about how we stop asking why doesn't she leave and asking why doesn't he stop. So that's one of and I know I'm using kind of gender there, but we know that predominantly this happens to female victims with male perpetrators, but not always, and so it's important to really say that. So to do that means that there needs to be the right help and support available for survivors, that's adult and children survivors, of domestic abuse, as well as the people who perpetrate abuse. And also that needs to start early. So when we start to see signs, whether that's within the home, so the adolescent to parent abuse that might take place at home, whether that's in school where young people start displaying, harmful behaviours, that we make sure that we are trying to prevent abuse as early as we possibly can. And that's not just from experiencing it, but that's from using it. I think the worry, so there was some big announcements this week about increasing funding for services for perpetrators of abuse, and obviously we welcome that. We have a program called Drive. Again, Louisa, we can share some information about our Drive program. But that's about providing specialist one-to-one support for perpetrators, which is actually it's not available across the country. It's only available in pockets. But we know that there's a really good evidence base for that work, so we can share some of that. But I've forgotten what I was going to say. Sorry. Moving on to the from that to about kind of making sure that the funding that ends up being poured into the services that we need to create for perpetrators of abuse doesn't get taken from the already kind of very, very tight funding that is being provided for survivors of abuse. So it's about making sure that there's adequate funding for all, which is the big challenge, isn't it?
As a sort of final question that leads on from that, we've been following the new domestic abuse bill that's being put through the House of Lords at the moment, and I was wondering if that is in any way giving you an optimistic view of like how for what you're just talking about, basically, if funding for these different aspects would be helped or improved by this bill passing, and how else it would affect the work that you do.
Yes, the domestic abuse bill and just the stages that it has to go through creates an enormous amount of discussion and attention on the issue, and we always welcome that. Raising the profile. This is an issue that affects everyone in society from all walks of life. So whatever opportunities there are to kind of raise the profile and the issues in society, within Parliament, we always welcome that. One of the things that we're trying to campaign for in the bill is to ensure that there's a statutory recognition for provision of community-based services as well as accommodation-based services. So just kind of going back to I think one of your points, Catherine, about the emphasis on victims leaving their home, that's often been quite a traditional way that victims have sought help fleeing into refuge, but we know that there aren't enough refuge spaces. But we also know that's not often where victims and their children want to be.
Definitely not for everyone.
Stay at home. They want to stay, connected to the people around them, their family, their community. So community-based services need to be recognised on equal footing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for talking to us, joining us today. We'll put any links to SafeLives website and that into our comments, or into our description. Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. It's been great to talk to you.